At the turn of the 19th century, an estimated 125,000 Native Americans lived on lands in Alabama, Georgia, and North Carolina, and these lands had been inhabited for time immemorial. By the mid-1800s, very few Indigenous Americans remained in these territories. The federal government of the United States forced thousands of natives on arduous marches that crossed the Mississippi River into new territories further east. Many would not survive this journey as room was made for the growing United States, often to create cotton plantations or taking over lands that had been cultivated by the tribes. We will focus on the Cherokee people and their removal from Georgia. Official reports at the time stated that 400 people had died. However, in reality, the number was actually around 4,000 people, which equated to 25% of the population. In today's video, we will cover the events that led up to the Trail of Tears and what the people went through during this period. It is perhaps helpful to start with the situation for the Cherokee. The difference in cultures between the Indigenous and European Americans was a constant source of problems, especially in the frontiers. But the Cherokee had little issue with this, having become largely integrated with the European Americans, in part due to the trade between the two groups. The Cherokee people were recognized as an independent nation, had their own written constitution and written language, a bilingual newspaper, and higher literacy rates than most at the time. In the 1930s, the Cherokee Nation numbered 16,500 Cherokee, 200 intermarried European Americans, and around 1,600 slaves. Many of these Indigenous Americans had settled homes, were taking part in forms of government, had enrolled their children into missionary schools, or were engaged in industries other than agriculture. The Cherokee were part of 5 civilized tribes, along with the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Creek. Much like the Cherokee, these tribes attempted to assimilate in some way with the European Americans. However, there were those who wished to remove the Native American tribes and occupy their land. In 1828, prospectors struck gold on Cherokee lands, which in turn drew more and more people to the area in hopes they too could strike gold. Many of these prospectors trespassed onto Cherokee land and often caused violent disputes. These disputes only pushed the desire to remove the Cherokee peoples from their land as soon as possible. In addition to the gold, valuable farming land and developments in harvesting cotton also made the area desirable for those wishing to monopolize and expand the industry. In May of 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. The act gave powers to grant the Indigenous Americans land in the western prairies and east of the Mississippi River, often to Oklahoma, which was seen as worthless due to the difficulties in establishing farms. This would be in exchange for their highly desired ancestral lands. In June of 1830, the Cherokee elected leadership, under Chief John Ross, submitted their complaint to the Supreme Court that Georgia had passed laws that prohibited non-Cherokee persons to live on Cherokee lands without obtaining approval from the state. Georgia for a time had been pushing for the removal of the Cherokee people from Georgia, but with little success, and it is thought that these laws were designed to exert pressure to concede agreeing to the removal. The Cherokee Nation looked to obtain a federal injunction from Georgia on these laws, but the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. It instead ruled that it had no jurisdiction to hear the case from the Cherokee Nation, as it was deemed as an independent nation with a relationship to the United States akin to that of a ward to its guardian. Instead, a Christian missionary named Samuel Worcester brought the case as he had been convicted by Georgia of living on Cherokee land without a license. In this case, Georgia was ruled to have created an unconstitutional law and was a key step in establishing the nation of tribal sovereignty. However, there was little enforcement of this decision, and Samuel was not released from prison until January of 1833. Andrew Jackson made little efforts to enforce the decision, and instead continued with his policy of Native American removal. He is often attributed with a quote stating that if the Supreme Court made their decision, they can enforce it, not him. In a meeting with Jackson shortly after the case, John Ridge, a clerk of the Cherokee National Council, inquired whether Jackson would use the power of the federal government against Georgia. Jackson confirmed he had no such intention, and instead reiterated that the Cherokee Nation should accept that they were to be removed from their land and negotiate a treaty, making it clear removal would happen regardless of the Supreme Court's ruling. Whilst the majority of the Cherokee people were opposed to any treaty agreeing to their removal, a small faction emerged that were prepared to accept the terms of the removal treaty. The treaty party believed that the treaty was the only way to secure the future of the Cherokee people, even if that meant losing their land. They believed it was better to secure enough compensation for their land and avoid potential violence. Earlier removal of the Creek and Choctaw tribes was seen as examples of what may befall the Cherokee. The Ross Party, led by Chief Ross, were opposed to the notion of removal. Whilst prepared to cede some land, they were only prepared to do so if they could remain in the East and were subject to state law. Such positions were flatly rejected by the United States. Separate negotiations led by both parties continued to seek a solution, but it was in 1835 that the now infamous New Yokota Treaty was ratified. The New Yokota Treaty was negotiated between the United States government and the unelected treaty party. Whilst their intentions can be seen as an attempt to avoid an escalation in the removal dispute and save the Cherokee people, it is important to note that these were not the elected representatives of the Cherokee Nation. The treaty gave the United States government the authority to remove the Cherokee people from the lands and property with a deadline of 2 years, in exchange for land to the west and monetary compensation. The true elected officials of the Cherokee Nation immediately objected, and the Ross Party set about obtaining signatures in protest of the treaty. In total, around 15,000 signatures, which was nearly the entirety of the Cherokee people, were obtained and presented to the United States government as proof that those signed the treaty were not representing the Cherokee people. Regardless, the treaty was ratified by the United States despite clear evidence that those who signed it did not have authority to do so. Around 2,000 Cherokee people left their lands voluntarily and travelled westward, the treaty party amongst them. The vast majority did not. 2 days after the deadline to leave had passed, the then President Martin Van Buren ordered the United States Army to forcibly remove any who remained. In May of 1838, General Winfield Scott and some 7,000 soldiers were dispatched to evict those who had refused to comply with the treaty, often at gunpoint. Over the course of a month, 15,000 Cherokee and their 2,000 black slaves were rounded up and sent into holding camps. These were little more than pens, often with little food and supplies. Around 1,000 people died due to the squalid conditions of these camps. As families were ripped from their homes, unscrupulous people would purchase the property from the evicted. As such transactions were often done at gunpoint, these deals were often very little more than daylight robbery. This, however, was the best case scenario, as more often than not, homes and farms would be ransacked by groups of brigands, who would often follow the soldiers as they removed the Cherokee people. The Cherokee people who were given permission to return home would often find nothing left, and in some cases, even the graves of their loved ones had been dug up and the jewellery or other ornaments stolen from the dead. From these camps, many were loaded into steamboats and trains and sent to the west. Very often, these boats were too small, with families crammed together. The groups of Cherokee were escorted by United States soldiers. There were often accounts of the officers who would lead the groups to their new lands. A link will be in the description for one such account from Lieutenant Edward Dees. Those who were sent on these initial methods were spared the harsher treatment of those who were sent overland on foot. Those forced to march were sent along the 2,200-mile route, with many of those suffering from illness, cold, and exhaustion. Limited provisions were loaded into wagons. The old, the sick, and the young children would ride in the wagons, while rest would travel on foot. These dire conditions claimed thousands of lives. According to one witness who had come across a group of around 1,000 Cherokee travelling along the Trail of Tears, he saw the following. "We found the road literally filled with procession for nearly 3 miles in length. The sick and feeble were carried in wagons. Multitudes go on foot. Even aged females apparently nearly ready to drop in the grave were travelling with heavy burdens, sometimes on the frozen ground with no covering for feet. They buried 14 or 15 at every stopping place. There were protests before the removals as to when the Cherokee could be kicked off their land. They were to be sent away during what was known as the sickness season. This was when it was colder and illnesses would be more common. Due to the freezing temperatures, even obtaining water required cutting through inches of ice. Every aspect of life was made that much harder due to the time of the year the Cherokee were made to vacate. Sleet and snowstorms caused many to develop pneumonia. Amongst them was Chief John Ross's wife, Quate Ross. She was reported to have given one of the few blankets to a sickly child, leaving herself without any protection. Illnesses resulted in many deaths, made worse by severe exposure. Contagious diseases such as cholera, influenza, dysentery, and tuberculosis were commonplace. Those who died would be buried in shallow graves before the rest of the party would be moved on. One witness to the forced removals was Private John G. Burnett, who recounted his role in 1890. In Burnett's view, the Trail of Tears was the most brutal order in the history of American warfare. As someone who was able to speak Cherokee, he was able to act as an interpreter, but also as a guard. He would witness as many as 20 people dying a night due to exposure, and was involved in an altercation where he stopped another soldier whipping an elderly man to move faster. A link to his account will be in the description, and I strongly recommend you take the time to read it. When they finally reached their prescribed destination, the weary travelers were met by the United States soldiers. Most of the Cherokee went on to settle with those who had already arrived by boat and train, setting up in present-day Oklahoma. There were many European Americans who opposed the removals, a notable example being Davy Crockett, but there were plenty of people who were happy to benefit from the seized land. Reprisals were taken against the group who had signed the Treaty of New Yokota, leading to the assassination of John Ridge and those other unelected people that had doomed so many. On the 22nd of June 1839, a group of 25 Ross Party members attacked John Ridge, his father Major Ridge, and another key member of the treaty party, Elias Boudinot. John in particular was dragged from his bed, stabbed 26 times, and then stamped to death, all in front of his family. What is particularly devastating about the Trail of Tears is the demographics of those who died. In general, those who died were those who were not able to keep up with the arduous trek. The main victims were the elderly and the children. This would result in the Cherokee people being largely robbed of their future in their children and their past in losing their elders. The Trail of Tears, which affected the Cherokee people, is but one of many Native American removals. The Treaty of New Yokota may have been signed to avoid dire situations for the Cherokee people, yet through the Trail of Tears, many still suffered and perished, an estimated 4,000 men, women and children. Andrew Jackson's decision to ignore the judiciary and its role as to check his executive power, as well as his Indian removal policies, ought to be remembered. I would strongly recommend you to take the time to read the accounts of those who witnessed and went through the Trail of Tears, in a bid to remember that the events of the past do shape our present and future.